I want you to imagine you're in a quiet room, sitting at a table. In front of you is a single button and a special clock with a rapidly spinning hand. A researcher gives you one simple instruction. Whenever you feel the spontaneous urge to do so, press the button. Just be sure to remember the exact position of the clock hand at the very moment you decide to act. So you wait. The clock hand spins. A few seconds pass, and then you feel it. A flicker of intention, a conscious thought that says, now. Your finger moves. You press the button, and you note the time. It feels like the most basic demonstration of free will imaginable. An action born from a decision you made, right there in the moment. But the researchers, who've been monitoring the electrical activity in your brain, find something unsettling. The specific brain signal that initiated the physical action of pressing the button fired a full half second before you consciously felt the desire to move. Let that sink in. Your brain had already started the process before you were even aware of making a choice. The feeling of deciding wasn't the spark that lit the fuse. It was more like the sound of an explosion that had already happened.
This raises a profound question. If your conscious will just shows up late to the party for a simple button press, what about all the other choices you think you're making? Okay, let's unpack this. This startling thought experiment, it really just catapults us headfirst into one of the oldest, probably one of the trickiest and most, enduring debates out there, free will versus determinism.
Right. It's not just some philosophical parlor game confined to ivory towers, is it? This question, it touches everything. How we hold people accountable in society, right down to the very core of how we perceive ourselves as, autonomous beings.
It's true. And what's truly fascinating here is that this isn't merely a conceptual puzzle we just sort of wrestle with in our minds. Modern science, particularly, the rapidly advancing field of neuroscience, is giving us genuinely new empirical insights.
Actual data.
Exactly. Actual data that actively challenges our most fundamental intuitions about who is truly in control of our actions. It's a profoundly interdisciplinary inquiry, really. It demands a deep dive into the very architecture of our thoughts, our decisions, and, our actions.
And that's precisely our mission today. We're going to try and pull back the curtain on this really intricate debate, explore the latest thinking that spans neuroscience, philosophy, and even how this all plays out in our burgeoning digital lives.
Our aim is to illuminate what these powerful ideas might mean for you, for our society at large, and for how we understand ourselves in an increasingly interconnected and, technologically mediated world.
It's a big one.
It is. Get ready for some unexpected twists and turns, because the answer's here.
Yeah.
Well, it might not be what you'd expect. Okay, so that wild experiment we just heard about in the intro, the one with the button and the clock, it's directly inspired by the groundbreaking work of a pioneering scientist named Benjamin Libet.
Libet, yeah. His work really stirred things up.
It did. His experiments and then later some complementary work by Daniel Wegner, they really ignited this modern scientific challenge to the traditional, deeply ingrained idea of free will.
Kicked it off in a big way, scientifically speaking.
Let's delve a little deeper into Libet's setup then, because it was, ingeniously simple in its design, really.
Yeah.
Volunteers were asked to do something very basic. Just press a button whenever they felt a spontaneous urge. Simple enough. But here's the crucial twist. They also had to pay close attention to a special clock, one with a hand spinning really rapidly. And their job was to remember the exact position of that clock hand at the precise moment they first became consciously aware of their decision or their intention to move.
That timing is key, the moment of awareness.
Exactly. And meanwhile, the researchers were diligently measuring their brain activity, specifically looking for something called the readiness potential.
Ah, yes, the RP Bereitschafts potential, originally.
That's the one. And this isn't some abstract concept, right? The readiness potential is a well-established electrical signal. It clearly indicates the brain is, in fact, preparing for a voluntary movement before the movement itself actually occurs.
It's a preparatory signal, the brain gearing up, essentially.
Right, and this is where the implications become truly profound, isn't it?
Absolutely, because Libet consistently found that this readiness potential, this unconscious brain activity, this neural preparation, it reliably occurred a full half second before the volunteers reported their conscious awareness of deciding to press the button.
Half a second. That feels like an eternity in brain time.
It's significant, neurologically speaking, yes. So if we connect this finding to the bigger picture, this neuroscientific evidence, particularly the consistent appearance of this readiness potential before conscious awareness, is seen by many, not everyone, but many, as a direct empirical challenge to the very notion of human freedom and conscious choice.
It just pulls the rug out from under it, potentially.
It strongly suggests a more deterministic view, yeah, where what we perceive as a free choice might actually be the calculated output of our complex biological systems, influenced by countless unseen streams of data and, prior events, prior causes.
So the feeling of choosing is more like an after effect.
It forces us to grapple with that idea, definitely, that our subjective experience of making a choice might be a product of our brain's sophisticated architecture, rather than the primary initiating cause of our actions, like the thunder after the lightning strike.
Okay, so if that's the case, what does this startling finding actually mean for our cherished intuitive belief in free will? I mean, this is a question that really rattles the foundations of how we see ourselves, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
And one very influential biologist and neurologist, Robert Sapolsky, he takes this to its most radical conclusion. He argues there is simply no free will whatsoever, full stop.
He's very clear on that. No ambiguity.
No ambiguity at all, and he doesn't mince words. He even posits that truly internalizing this idea, genuinely believing that free will doesn't exist, would paradoxically lead to, and this is his quote, a far more humane world.
Which seems counterintuitive at first glance.
Very. But his reasoning is, well, let's get into it. Sapolsky utterly dismisses our intuitive feeling of choice, like picking vanilla over chocolate ice cream, or more seriously, a soldier pulling a trigger. He calls that feeling completely irrelevant to the actual question of free will.
Why irrelevant? Because the feeling itself is determined.
Exactly. His reasoning is that the intent itself, that flicker of I choose this, has a much deeper origin. It's part of a sprawling chain of influences stretching back not just seconds or minutes, but potentially, eons.
A long chain of causation.
A very long chain. He meticulously details this intricate chain. First, he says, there's your immediate past. The events of the last second, minute, or hour. What you just saw, heard, felt that profoundly influences your very next action.
Makes sense. Recent context matters.
Then, zooming out, your personal history looms incredibly large. Think about childhood experiences, things like physical, psychological, or even sexual abuse, or a family history rife with incarceration or substance abuse.
Those adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs.
Precisely. Sapolsky points to compelling studies showing that each additional AC score can increase the likelihood of antisocial violence in adulthood by a staggering 35%. Think about how deeply those early experiences literally carve pathways in the developing brain.
Shaping neural architecture, risk responses.
Everything. But he doesn't stop there. Beyond your personal history, there's the pervasive influence of the culture you were raised in. Were you brought up in, say, a culture of honor, like parts of the American South? Studies show they can lead to more aggressive responses and elevated stress hormones in certain specific situations.
Compared to other cultural norms.
Right. Or were you raised in a more individualistic or a collectivist culture? That shapes your fundamental approaches to trust, cooperation, even how you perceive fairness. And specific values like, turn the other cheek versus take revenge, these are deeply ingrained. Often unconsciously, just through cultural immersion.
So biology, personal history, culture, what else?
Oh, he keeps going deeper. Sapolsky's analysis digs right into genetics. He notes that your genes play an undeniable role, influencing predispositions towards things like violence, impulsivity, risk-taking. Even how your brain processes satiety based on variations in, say, leptin receptor genes, which affects obesity risk.
Nature and nurture, dialed up to 11.
Exactly. And if you push back even further, tracing the historical currents, your ancestral history also contributes in subtle ways. For instance, did your ancestors live in regions with a heavy infectious disease load? Some research suggests that might have subtly influenced a group's historical tendency to be perhaps more hostile or cautious towards immigration, towards outsiders.
That's a fascinating link.
Or were they, say, shepherds, who often developed historically more aggressive traits, perhaps needed to protect their herds, contrasting maybe with the more cooperative dispositions often found in settled farming communities over generations.
So layer upon layer of influence.
Layer upon layer upon layer. Sapolsky's core unyielding point is that all behavior, every single action, every thought stems from one continuous arc of biology in which there is not a crack there into which you can shoehorn free will.
No gap for a freely choosing self to jump in.
That's his argument. He really throws down the gauntlet, challenging anyone who believes in free will. Show him a brain or a person acting completely independent of every single one of those biological and environmental influences he's so meticulously outlined.
That's a high bar.
It's an incredibly high bar. He argues quite forcefully that the onus is entirely on those who believe in free will to provide this elusive evidence. Because from a purely biological perspective, he argues, our actions appear to be the inevitable, determined outcome of this vast, interconnected, and unbelievably complex history.
This exhaustive tracing of influences, I mean, from immediate neurological signals like the readiness potential all the way back to ancestral genetic predispositions. It leads us right back to that crucial philosophical query, doesn't it? Is our conscious will truly epiphenomenal?
Just riding along.
Just riding along, merely a byproduct or an after effect of these deeper processes without any actual causal power? Or are there complex nuances to the phenomenon of consciousness itself that scientific experiments, particularly those like Libet's focusing on simple button presses, alone cannot fully capture or explain?
Right. Is the experiment too simple? Does it miss something vital about real-world decisions?
Possibly. Sapolsky's comprehensive argument, delving into epigenetics, evolution, culture, it compels us to look far beyond simple immediate causes. It suggests a much deeper, richer tapestry of causation. But does that tapestry leave any room for conscious intervention, even if limited? That's the debate.
That's a critical distinction. If the science seems so compelling in its, deterministic leanings, what exactly are these nuances that empirical approaches might be missing? Are philosophers just, trying to hold on to an outdated concept because it feels good? Or is there a genuine blind spot in the purely scientific approach when it comes to something as intricate and frankly mysterious as human consciousness and will?
That's the crux of the philosophical critique.
This is where the philosophical critique of experiments like Libet's and Wegener's really enters the conversation. They argue that simply relying on this kind of empirical data, like the timing of the readiness potential, might not be enough to dismiss free will entirely.
They push back on the interpretation of the data.
Exactly. For instance, philosophers like Ferdinand Fossé-Blankson and Hussein Inoussa, they contend that the conclusions drawn from Libet's and Wegener's work are, in their words, marred with some philosophical inconsistencies. They point to what they see as misconceptions, logical errors, and causal fallacies in how the science is interpreted to deny free will.
Strong words. What's their main point?
Their key argument is profound, I think. They believe that empirical inquiry alone limits the study of the role of consciousness and its involvement in decision-making. Basically, looking only at brain timings isn't the whole story.
It misses the subjective experience, perhaps, or the complexity of consciousness.
That seems to be the idea. They suggest, quite pointedly, that scientific assessment alone may not be exhaustive for fully evaluating something as complex as free will, especially when you consider the dynamic, ongoing role of consciousness and, as they put it, the absence of causal evidence between the interactions of the mind and the brain.
Ah, the mind-brain problem rearing its head again.
Precisely. They imply a more complex interplay between our subjective conscious experience and our brain activity than a simple linear cause and effect chain that can be reduced purely to neuronal firing patterns measured by an EEG.
So in essence, they're suggesting that while science provides invaluable data about when brain activity occurs relative to conscious awareness, maybe for these very simple arbitrary tasks,
Right.
It may not fully illuminate the nature or the causal role of conscious involvement in more complex deliberative decision-making over time.
Right. Maybe pressing a button whenever isn't representative of choosing a career or
Right.
deciding who to marry.
Exactly. This directly challenges Sapolsky's view that our intuition about choice is just a lousy guide. These philosophers argue that consciousness might play a role that transcends what our current empirical methods can fully capture. It hints at a more complex, perhaps even non-reductive relationship between mind and brain than a straightforward mechanical sequence of events.
So the readiness potential might show us the how or when of the brain preparing for action.
But it doesn't necessarily fully resolve the why or the nuanced role of consciousness in forming intentions, weighing options, or even vetoing an initial urge, which Libet himself actually discussed.
Okay, so what we've really gleaned in this first part is, it's a truly mind-bending idea, isn't it? Science, through experiments like Libet's, suggests our conscious will might be more of a witness, a kind of trailing awareness, rather than the primary commander of our actions, at least for simple movements.
That's one strong interpretation, yes.
And then we have this incredibly compelling, comprehensive deterministic argument from someone like Sapolsky, who posits that our choices are just the inevitable unfolding of a deeply interconnected biological and environmental history.
A continuous arc, as he puts it.
But As we've just heard, there's also a robust philosophical counterargument reminding us of the potential limits of purely empirical inquiry when it comes to the sheer complexity of consciousness. This isn't just a philosophical quirk. It's a direct challenge to the very idea of individual agency as we intuitively understand it.
And that challenge has massive implications, right? Because if these neuroscientific insights are pointing towards a more deterministic picture, and our choices really are the culmination of these deep historical, biological, environmental currents, many of which are beyond our immediate conscious control.
Then what does that mean for how we hold people accountable, particularly within our legal systems? This is a really crucial point because, let's face it, our entire system of justice, certainly criminal justice, is built fundamentally on the premise of individual responsibility, on the idea that people choose their actions freely.
Exactly. Culpability, blame, punishment, they all seem to hinge on that assumption of free will.
I've been thinking a lot about the profound tension this whole topic creates between, the science of determinism and the societal need for accountability. It's easy to discuss this in abstract philosophical terms, but what does it genuinely mean for people's actual lives? For real individuals facing real consequences?
It needs grounding in reality.
It does. To make this debate more tangible, I tried to find a story that gives it a human face. So I want you to try to imagine a young public defender in Mumbai. Let's call him Samir. He's representing a teenager from the city's sprawling slums, a boy accused of a violent outburst that led to a serious injury for another person. Now, the prosecution, as legal systems typically do, paints a very simple and direct picture. Here's a young man with a history of aggression who made a conscious choice to commit a crime, and therefore he deserves punishment. Simple cause and effect, free choice leading to bad action. But Samir, who has been devouring literature on neuroscience, maybe he's read about Libet's experiments, maybe he's encountered Sapolsky's arguments, he sees something fundamentally different. He looks at this boy and sees a mind, a brain, that has been shaped perhaps irrevocably by a lifetime of extreme poverty, chronic malnutrition, and constant pervasive exposure to violence from his earliest days. Samir learns that the boy's father had an explosive, uncontrolled temper, a potential genetic or learned component there.
And that the boy himself suffered a significant head injury as a child that went completely untreated due to lack of resources, possibly damaging frontal lobe function involved in impulse control. In court, Samir finds himself in an impossible bind. He can't exactly stand up and argue, "Your Honor, his brain made him do it," because the legal system, with its bedrock principles, is built precisely on the foundation of individual responsibility, of free choice. That argument just doesn't fly, legally speaking. Yet as he looks at this scared kid, who barely seems to comprehend the proceedings or the gravity of a situation, Samir cannot shake the profound, unsettling feeling that the choice the prosecution is talking about, that moment of violent outburst, was merely the final, visible ripple in a pond, where the stones, the real causes, the stones of biology, environment, trauma, and history were thrown long, long before the boy was even born. Samir feels utterly trapped between a sworn duty to uphold the existing law and a powerful, new, and deeply compassionate understanding of human accountability based on this emerging science.
That story powerfully highlights the immense pressure points this whole debate creates within our existing justice systems. If we genuinely want to reduce crime, if we want to foster a more just and safer society, focusing solely on punishment, on the idea of retribution based on a shaky notion of free will, it's incredibly limited, isn't it?
It feels like treating the symptom, not the disease.
Exactly. It's akin to trying to stop a powerful river by merely building a small dam at its mouth, ignoring the vast watershed feeding it. We absolutely have to look much further upstream. We have to examine the intricate societal factors: poverty, inequality, lack of education, exposure to violence, and the biological and environmental sources that fundamentally carve the channels for these destructive behaviors in the first place.
So prevention becomes key.
Prevention, addressing root causes, systemic change. It suggests that if we are serious about addressing crime effectively, our strategies need to be far more comprehensive, focusing heavily on public health approaches, social support, and early intervention, rather than relying primarily on reactive and punitive measures after the harm has already occurred.
So if this scientific challenge to traditional free will gains more traction, then the entire concept of retributive justice, the idea that people deserve punishment because they freely chose to do wrong, an eye for an eye, it really struggles to find its moral footing, doesn't it?
It becomes deeply problematic ethically.
The question becomes incredibly uncomfortable. If people aren't truly free in that classic libertarian sense, if their actions are the inevitable outcome of factors largely beyond their immediate control, can we morally justify punishing them simply because they deserve it?
It pushes us to rethink the very purpose of the justice system.
It does. And this profound challenge has indeed led to serious explorations of some truly radical alternatives to our current justice models. These aren't just fringe ideas, they're being discussed by serious philosophers and legal scholars.
Like the public health model.
Exactly. One of the most prominent of these alternatives is the public health quarantine model, strongly advocated by philosophers like Greg Caruso and Dirk Pereboom. The analogy they use is quite striking and deliberately provocative.
How does it work?
They argue that just as a society is universally recognized as having a right to quarantine carriers of dangerous communicable diseases, like, say, during a pandemic to protect public health.
Okay, we accept that for diseases.
They argue society also possesses a moral right to isolate criminally dangerous individuals. But here's the crucial difference. This model doesn't presuppose moral responsibility, blame, or desert in the traditional retributive sense.
So it's not about punishment, it's about safety.
Precisely. The interventions, they argue, should be no more invasive than necessary and strictly proportional to the actual risk posed by the individual, much like public health measures are calibrated based on the severity and transmissibility of a disease. The ultimate goals are purely incapacitation and the protection of society. And these goals, they contend, are entirely consistent with skepticism about traditional free will. You don't need blame to justify protecting people from harm.
Okay. But that model surely faces some significant challenges, right? It sounds potentially dystopian if not handled carefully.
Oh, absolutely. The objections are numerous and quite thorny. Critics, like Michael Corrado, immediately point out that it doesn't adequately distinguish between dangerous individuals who might still possess some degree of control over their actions and those who don't. It risks treating all dangerous individuals as if they were mere biological threats like viruses, stripping away their personhood.
And the potential for overreach.
And that's a huge concern. There's a very real worry that such a system could cast a far too wide net, drawing an excessive number of people into a system of potentially indefinite incapacitation, maybe based on unreliable predictions of future dangerousness. Think about the potential for astronomically high compensation costs if you're locking people up without finding them morally culpable in the traditional sense.
And the quarantine analogy itself, does it really hold up?
Some argue it fundamentally misapplies the concept. Critics like Levin and colleagues contend that it fails to acknowledge the crucial ethical distinctions between medical contexts and criminal justice. Quarantine is usually temporary, aimed at preventing spread, not long-term incapacitation based on predicted behavior.
Plus, how good are we at predicting who is really dangerous?
That's another major problem. Scholars like Lavassa highlight the inherent unreliability of our current tools for predicting recidivism. The risk of false positives is high. How can we truly and ethically determine who is dangerous enough to be indefinitely quarantined based on predictions that might be wrong?
It could also stifle rehabilitation, couldn't it, if the focus is just on incapacitation?
Exactly. It could inadvertently disincentivize rehabilitation efforts or positive change in offenders. And most critically, there are profound concerns about the potential for suppressing basic human rights and its inherent difficulty in accommodating reasons responsiveness. That is, an individual's capacity to understand and act for reasons, which is often seen as crucial for both moral agency and successful rehabilitation.
Okay, so the quarantine model is controversial. What else is out there?
Well, then there's the even more, shall we say, futuristic and controversial proposal. Moral enhancement through neurobiological interventions. This sounds straight out of science fiction.
Like directly modifying brains to make people better.
Essentially, yes. This idea isn't just about treating existing conditions like aggression linked to a brain tumor. It proactively suggests using neurotechnologies to make individuals more altruistic and more oriented to justice, while simultaneously decreasing anti-moral emotions or dispositions like extreme aggression, lack of empathy, or severe impulsivity.
Wow.
Some proponents, including very serious scholars, even see this as a potential futuristic alternative to incarceration and criminal sanctions. They frame it as possibly a more humane way to manage societal threats than locking people away for decades.
More humane than prison, maybe, but altering someone's personality.
And it gets even more extreme. Some scholars, notably Ingmar Persson and Julian Savulescu, go so far as to argue for compulsory moral enhancement in certain extreme hypothetical cases. For instance, to prevent what they call ultimate harm, something catastrophic that could make worthwhile life on this planet forever impossible, like someone about to unleash a devastating bioweapon, perhaps.
Compulsory brain modification by the state, that raises massive red flags.
Massive red flags. As you can imagine, this concept unleashes a torrent of ethical alarms and urgent questions. Critics like Jan-Christoph Bublitz forcefully argue that such proposals could easily lead down a slippery slope to a terrifying police state. He states unequivocally that the state's existing punitive powers cannot ethically justify mandatory neuro-rehabilitation.
It violates fundamental rights.
Absolutely. Critics contend it would violate fundamental concepts of human dignity. Particularly in the Kantian sense, the idea that individuals should always be treated as ends in themselves, never merely as means to an end, even the end of public safety. It also deeply infringes upon basic human rights and what philosophers increasingly call cognitive liberty.
Cognitive liberty, the right to control your own mind.
Exactly. The fundamental right to self-determination over one's own mind and mental processes, the freedom to choose one's thoughts, beliefs, and personality, free from external coercion or manipulation. Compulsory moral enhancement seems like the ultimate violation of that.
And the methods themselves could be brutal.
Critics point out it could entail unspeakable brutality, like forcibly implanting deep brain stimulation, DBS devices, into individuals, perhaps targeting circuits related to empathy or aggression, even for complex behavioral patterns like psychopathy, which isn't even a universally agreed-upon diagnosis. Furthermore, such interventions could easily be seen as violating international prohibitions against cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment.
This is truly the nexus where societal safety clashes head-on with individual rights and fundamental human dignity, isn't it? How do we even begin to balance the collective good, the understandable need to protect society from harm, with the profound imperative to preserve the autonomy and integrity of the individual, especially when we're contemplating interventions that literally touch the very core of a person's being, their mind, their personality, their self?
The ethical dilemmas are just immense.
They are, and it's worth noting that even those who propose these ideas, like Pereboom and Caruso, often offer a more nuanced approach in practice. They tend to advocate for prioritizing rehabilitation methods that genuinely engage a person's rationality first. They see these more direct mechanical therapies as secondary options.
And crucially,
they almost always emphasize that such interventions should require the subject's informed consent, even for highly invasive methods like deep brain stimulation for individuals exhibiting psychopathic traits. The debate then shifts to whether consent under such circumstances can ever be truly free, but the principle of consent is usually upheld.
But the core questions remain. Who gets to define what constitutes moral behavior worthy of enhancement? And who possesses the authority to fundamentally alter another's mind, even if it's framed as being for the presumed betterment of society?
Deeply troubling questions.
They are. Which brings us to perhaps the most radical proposition emerging from this intersection of neuroscience and justice: neuroabolitionism.
Abolitionism, as in abolishing the current criminal justice system.
That's the ultimate aim, yes.
Yeah.
This perspective asserts that criminal law, as it currently exists, being so fundamentally underpinned by concepts of culpability and free will, is inherently problematic and ultimately unjust. Their core reasoning is that contemporary science, through its insights into both determinism and indeterminism, randomness doesn't help free will either, effectively undermines the very idea of free will in the traditional sense.
So free will is an illusion.
Then the principles of culpability, blameworthiness, and retribution, deserve punishment, which are its pillars, become, as neuroabolitionists put it, nonsensical, illogical, unjustified.
So what do they propose instead?
Neuroabolitionism calls for a truly scientific understanding of human behavior's determinate factors, meaning a deep dive into the complex interplay of neurobiological and environmental influences that shape behavior. It views criminal law not as a fair and impartial arbiter of justice, but rather as an outdated, often brutal social control tool that, ironically, often fails to limit suffering or provide meaningful contributions to social reality. It perpetuates cycles of harm, they argue.
So a complete paradigm shift.
A complete paradigm shift. Consequently, it advocates for a revolutionary departure from traditional criminal law and culpability-based justice.
What would that look like in practice? It sounds huge.
It is huge. In terms of practical implications, neuroabolitionism envisions the gradual long-term abolition of prisons as we know them. That's the ultimate goal. In the immediate and midterm, however, its focus is on radically humanizing the penal system, reducing sentences, improving conditions, ending solitary confinement, and massively expanding evidence-based rehabilitation efforts.
What about dangerous individuals in the meantime? What happens before prisons are abolished?
That's where the quarantine model we discussed might come in, but only very cautiously. Under a neuro-abolitionist framework, that model might only be supported as an exceptional temporal alternative, meaning temporary, and only for the most severe cases, specifically in non-socially situated cases. That means very rare instances where broad social policy changes and comprehensive mental health care interventions have unequivocally failed to address severe dangerousness, and even then, only as a strictly temporary measure with high safeguards.
And neurointerventions, where do they fit?
Neuroabolitionism strongly emphasizes the potential for what they call consensual neurocorrections as a potentially useful therapeutic avenue, but always with the paramount importance of individual consent. For example, they might cite a real case where the surgical resection of an orbitofrontal brain tumor, which had clearly caused a man to develop uncharacteristic and compulsive criminal behavior like sex crimes, provided a definitive solution to a clear neurological problem. That's seen as therapeutic.
So treatment, not enhancement, and only with consent.
Exactly. This stands in stark contrast to any form of mandatory enhancement. The guiding principles here are unwavering. Absolute respect for individual rights, human dignity, informed consent, and that concept of cognitive liberty. They stress that any interventions for mental or neurological disorders that might contribute to criminal behavior must always require genuinely informed consent from the individual.
And they don't reduce everything to the brain, right?
Critically, no. They also strongly remind us that human behavior is inherently socially, culturally situated. It's not exclusively neurobiological. Social factors, environment, culture, poverty, trauma. These are hugely important. Therefore, any judicial neurocorrections should always be consensual, viewed as a potential therapeutic option and considered a last resort. The priority should always be on less invasive social public policy interventions and comprehensive, accessible mental health care for everyone.
That sounds much more balanced.
Furthermore, neuroabolitionism offers a really radical redefinition of what we fundamentally value and what freedom truly means. It argues compellingly that sentient life, whether human or potentially non-human, is inherently worthy of respect, regardless of the refutation or affirmation of free will. This intrinsic value, they suggest, doesn't depend on what they consider a flawed metaphysical concept of traditional libertarian free will.
So value comes from sentience, not from freedom.
From consciousness, sentience, the capacity to experience life, yes. They also draw a crucial distinction between free will, which usually implies having genuine alternative possibilities and some kind of ultimate, uncaused control over one's choices, and what they might call natural freedom or positive freedom.
What's the difference?
Natural freedom is simply the absence of external constraints, like being physically forced, and possessing a basic level of volitional autonomy, being able to act on your desires and intentions, even if those desires are ultimately determined by prior causes. This natural freedom, they argue, is real, important, and can serve as a robust and sufficient basis for crucial ethical concepts like cognitive liberty and informed consent, without needing to assume the existence of a traditional, perhaps incoherent metaphysical free will.
Interesting. So we can still talk about freedom and rights without getting bogged down in the metaphysics of free will.
That's the argument. It represents a profound shift, really. It's about moving the entire conversation beyond blame, beyond mere retribution and punishment, towards a more difficult, yes, but ultimately more effective and arguably more compassionate focus on prevention, understanding root causes, implementing systemic change, and offering genuine rehabilitation. It's a complete reevaluation of how we understand human behavior and construct our societal responses to it, one that aims to reduce suffering by addressing the complex web of causes rather than simply assigning blame after the fact. This idea, though, embracing a more deterministic view, one where our choices are seen as the complex outcome of vast, intricate, and often unseen forces, it can sound initially scary, can't it? Like maybe we're losing control, or maybe it just becomes an excuse for bad behavior. Oh, it wasn't my fault, my biology made me do it.
That's definitely a common reaction, the fear of losing agency or responsibility.
But what if? What if it actually opens the door to something far more profound? Something that fosters deep compassion, not just for others, but for ourselves. Something that reduces that crippling self-blame we often carry, and maybe even cultivates a surprising sense of gratitude.
A shift in perspective rather than a loss.
Exactly. I recently heard another story, a much quieter one than Samir's, that I think beautifully illustrates this potential shift. It comes from a small village nestled near the sacred banks of the Narmada River in India. It's about a man in his 40s, a farmer named Harish, who'd been wrestling with a truly crippling sense of failure for years. A few years prior, a bad investment, based on what he genuinely believed at the time was a sure bet, had cost his family their entire life savings. He became completely consumed by self-blame, just replaying the moment of his decision endlessly in his mind, convinced of his own stupidity, his own weakness. This internal torment caused him to become withdrawn, bitter, and deeply isolated from his community. One afternoon, an elder from the village, a wise old woman, found him sitting alone by the river, just staring into the water. She didn't offer direct advice or simple platitudes. Instead, she simply pointed to the powerful, flowing water of the Narmada and said, "Harish, the Narmada thinks it chooses its path each day, doesn't it? Each bend, each swirl, it feels like a choice. But its course, its deep channel, was carved by mountains and ancient rock formations millions of years ago, long before this water even flowed." The elder then gently explained that Harish's devastating decision, the one he relentlessly blamed himself for, wasn't made in a vacuum. It wasn't just him being foolish, it was a confluence of so many factors. His upbringing, which perhaps had instilled in him a bold, maybe overly optimistic risk-taking spirit. The immense financial pressures he was under at the time, the desperation to provide for his family, and perhaps the cunningly persuasive words of the man who sold him the flawed investment idea. She told him, "You were a river, Harish, flowing in a channel shaped by your life's geology. You couldn't have flowed uphill." The story goes that hearing this, something profound shifted within Harish. The immense, crushing weight of personal failure began slowly, painstakingly to lift. It wasn't replaced by indifference or excuse-making, but by a dawning sense of humility, a recognition of the vast forces at play. And then, surprisingly, a feeling of gratitude surfaced, gratitude for the things he still had. His family who still loved him, his health, the land, the river itself. He realized he couldn't change the past, the water that had flowed, but he could stop drowning himself in blame for it.
That story, I think, is just such a powerful antidote to the harsh, often relentless self-judgment our modern culture so often promotes. We are constantly bombarded with messages to be self-made, to take control, to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And so when we inevitably fail, as everyone does, we often internalize the belief that we are the sole culpable architects of our own ruin. We blame ourselves mercilessly.
I really do.
This story, however, offers a gentler, perhaps far more realistic path. It's not about making excuses, as you said, not for ourselves or for others. It's about fostering a deeper, more profound kind of self-compassion, the kind of compassion that is absolutely essential for mental well-being, for resilience, for simply getting back up and moving forward after setbacks. It allows us to forgive ourselves more readily.
And others too.
And by extension, yes, it cultivates a much greater capacity to forgive others, to see their struggles, their mistakes, not merely as personal moral failings, but as complex outcomes shaped by a multitude of forces, biological, social, historical. Once we start to understand those forces, even partially, it can indeed lead to a more compassionate, less judgmental view of humanity as a whole.
This transformative view of ourselves, seeing us not as isolated, independent decision-makers floating free from context, but as an integral part of a larger determined system, is beautifully illuminated by a few powerful analogies used in some of the philosophical discussions around this. First, let's return to the Narmada River itself.
The river analogy is potent.
It is. The river feels free as it carves its path, right? Each bend, each surge, it feels like an active choice from the river's perspective if it had one. But a seasoned geologist understands its journey as the inescapable result of a deep and ancient past. Its course is determined by immovable geological constraints, hitting hard basalt formations here, finding yielding soft marble there. Our minds, the analogy suggests, might be profoundly similar. We follow a channel carved for us by a history we cannot even see. A channel shaped by our genetics, our upbringing, our culture, our environment. The feeling of freedom we experience, that's simply our subjective awareness of this determined, continuous flow. It's the feeling of the flow.
What about the artist?
Right, next, consider the artist at her canvas. When she makes what feels like an inspired choice for a particular brushstroke, maybe a vibrant hue she suddenly picks, or a bold, unexpected line, it feels like pure, spontaneous creativity emerging right there in the moment, untouched by anything but inspiration.
The muse strikes.
Exactly. Yet that seemingly spontaneous stroke is actually the product, the culmination of maybe 10,000 hours of rigorous study, countless past observations, a vast accumulation of memories, techniques learned, failures experienced, successes enjoyed. It's the fruit of a tree that had been growing for decades. Her choice in that moment is not uncaused. It is the exquisite synthesis, the emergent property of a vast, complex personal history and deeply ingrained expertise. It had to come from somewhere.
It's built on everything that came before.
And the third analogy, the third one brings it right into our daily interactions. Imagine yourself in a tense conversation. Your immediate reaction, whether it's a sudden surge of anger, a wave of sadness washing over you, or a sudden stony silence, it feels undeniably like a conscious, immediate choice you're making right then.
I chose to get angry, or I chose to shut down.
Right. Yet this impulse, seemingly so new, is in reality, according to this view, a confluence of countless streams. It's your unique genetics influencing your temperament. It's the specifics of your upbringing and how you learn to handle conflict. It's your accumulated memories of similar situations, triggering old patterns. It's even your current physiological state. Maybe you haven't slept well, maybe your blood sugar's low. It's truly the calculated output of all the data you contain from your entire life up to that precise point.
So the feeling of freedom comes from ignorance of the causes.
That's the idea. The profound feeling of freedom, the sensation of making a choice right now, arises precisely because you are not, and indeed cannot be, consciously aware of all these hidden calculations and deeply embedded influences operating beneath the surface. You only experience the final, immediate result, the emotion, the word, the action emerging from this deep, complex, and largely unconscious process.
If we take these analogies seriously, connecting them to the bigger picture, this reinterpretation of agency means that our traditional concepts of merit, of individual success and failure, they get powerfully reframed, don't they?
Completely reframed. Consider the simple yet profound mango saplings analogy that sometimes comes up in these discussions. Imagine two mango saplings. One is planted in rich, fertile soil, gets ample water, generous sunlight. Naturally, it'll likely grow strong, healthy, and yield abundant fruit.
Ideal conditions.
Right. Now imagine another sapling, from the same stock perhaps, but it's planted in rocky, depleted soil, gets insufficient water, and is stuck in too much shade. It will likely remain stunted, struggle, and produce little or no fruit. We intuitively understand that their success or failure is fundamentally based on their conditions, on their soil, not on some inherent moral worthiness or blameworthiness of the saplings themselves. We don't praise the lucky one and blame the unlucky one.
We understand the environmental impact.
Exactly. Now, applying this analogy to people carefully offers a radically different perspective on success and failure. Our successes, our flourishing, often come from what we might call good soil, a stable, nurturing home environment growing up, access to quality education and healthcare, maybe having a healthy and optimally functioning brain, encountering positive role models, being born into opportunity.
Our lucky breaks. The privileges.
Call them what you will.
Yeah.
Conversely, struggle and failure often emerge from rocky ground, a background marked by poverty, systemic disadvantage, childhood trauma, lack of opportunity, chronic stress, or perhaps neurological challenges. This perspective doesn't dismiss the importance of effort by any means. Effort is certainly crucial, like water or nutrients for the sapling. It makes a difference.
But it's not the only thing.
Exactly. It's seen as just one vital ingredient among many, interacting within a vast, intricate, and deeply interconnected system of influences.
This insight, if truly embraced, could lead to a really significant shift in our collective attitude, couldn't it?
Profoundly. Instead of automatically blaming individuals for their failures or struggles, we are encouraged to focus much more on understanding the conditions that lead to failure. We begin to see successful people not just as individually meritorious superhumans who did it all themselves, but perhaps more accurately, as fortunate expressions of a favorable set of circumstances, beneficiaries of good soil interacting with their own efforts.
And this view has truly transformative implications for society. Justice, as we discussed, would naturally lean much more heavily towards rehabilitation, prevention, and addressing systemic inequalities, rather than focusing primarily on retribution.
Our pride in our own achievements might be.
It would be tempered with gratitude, wouldn't it? Gratitude for the conditions, the luck, the support systems that enabled our success, and any lingering resentment towards others who struggle or fail might be softened with compassion as we recognize the complex, often invisible forces shaping their lives and limiting their opportunities.
Our admiration shifts.
Our admiration shifts, perhaps, from solely focusing on the individual achiever to appreciating the whole system that allowed it to flourish. Acknowledging the profound interconnectedness of all factors, individual effort, yes, but also luck, environment, biology, history, society.
So it's crucial to emphasize, this doesn't mean we're helpless puppets. It doesn't mean we have no agency or that our conscious lives don't matter. Far from it.
No, it's more nuanced than that.
The forces guiding us, these deep currents, are simply the sum total of who we are right now. Our unique history, our specific biology, our present environment, our learned habits, our values. The brain, this incredibly complex organ that is us, does the choosing based on all that input, and to create a coherent, functioning sense of self, capable of navigating the world effectively, it generates this powerful, subjective sensation of being in command, of exercising free will.
A necessary illusion, perhaps? Or a useful representation?
You could call it a kind of elegant user interface for an impossibly complex operating system that is our brain and body interacting with the world. This feeling of control, this deep-seated intuition, it allows us to navigate our lives with purpose, to set intentions, to plan for the future, and crucially, to embrace a practical sense of responsibility for our actions within our social context.
It's functionally vital.
Absolutely. It is what allows us to feel genuine pride in our accomplishments, motivating us to repeat successful behaviors. And it allows us to feel profound regret for our missteps, which is absolutely crucial for learning, for changing our behavior, and for building and maintaining a cohesive, functioning society based on trust and accountability. We are quite simply built to believe we are the drivers of our own destiny, because that belief helps us drive.
Now, some might try to rescue free will by suggesting that maybe our choices aren't determined, but they're truly random, perhaps originating from the unpredictable, chaotic nature of quantum physics at the subatomic level, bubbling up into our neural processes.
The quantum randomness escape hatch.
Right. But does that actually help? A choice caused by a purely random quantum event is no more genuinely your own, no more something you can take responsibility for than one determined by history or biology. It is simply an accident, a roll of the dice, unconnected to your character or values.
It doesn't give you control, just unpredictability.
Exactly. A truly meaningful choice, one that we can genuinely take ownership of, one that reflects who we are, must be fundamentally connected to who you are, to your identity, your personality, your values, your beliefs, your history. Randomness doesn't provide that connection. Determinism, counterintuitively, might provide a stronger basis for meaningful agency connected to the self.
Okay, so the idea of limited free will, or maybe a re-envisioned understanding of free will, grounded in our determined nature, it can initially feel like a profound loss, like a concession of personal agency, a demotion from captain to passenger.
It can feel that way, definitely. Deflating.
But it might, surprisingly, offer something else entirely. Perhaps a deeper, richer kind of connection to the world and to ourselves. It suggests that we are not separate, isolated entities distinct from our past or from our environment. Rather, we are a seamless, continuous unfolding of them.
Part of the flow.
Part of the flow. The thoughts, feelings, and impulses moving through us right now are indeed like the water of that mighty river, constantly flowing, moving, and following a channel uniquely carved by our individual history, our genetics, our experiences, our culture. The feeling of free will, that immediate subjective experience of choosing, is the experience of being that river. It is the felt sense of the current, the immediate awareness of the water moving within and through us.
That experience itself is real.
That experience is undeniably real, immediate, and utterly compelling. The path the river takes may indeed be shaped by history and biology, by forces beyond its immediate ken. But our living of it, our conscious awareness in each moment as we navigate that path, is precisely where life truly happens. It's where our agency, however shaped and constrained, is actually expressed. Understanding this might transform our very idea of freedom, not as an impossible escape from causation, but into something far richer and perhaps more profound. A deep and authentic connection to the grand, flowing, and deeply interconnected landscape of reality itself.
Experiencing the flow rather than trying to stand outside it.
It's a truly transformative idea, isn't it? It reshapes our very notion of what it means to be a human agent, to be alive and making choices moment by moment in the world.
It certainly does.
And speaking of human agency and how we experience reality, what happens when we throw the accelerating pace and, frankly, the omnipresence of digital technology into this already incredibly complex mix? How does our evolving understanding of choice, consciousness, and the self interact with the increasingly digital fabric of our lives, from how we work to how we learn to how we form relationships?
The digital dimension. This inevitably brings up a critical and increasingly urgent question. How do our deeply embodied human ways of engaging with the world, our fundamental reliance on physical cues, sensory input, bodily experience, that lived body, the philosophers talk about how does that intersect with digital technologies? Technologies that are often built on a fundamentally different premise, often involving a conceptual separation of cognition and embodiment.
Right. We operate daily in a physical, tangible world, feeling things, moving things. But so much of our interaction, our communication, our work, even our play, now happens in a virtual realm, a realm designed on abstract computational principles, often quite disembodied by its very design.
It's a clash of modes, almost.
It is. Let's unpack this with a fascinating debate that really contrasts two prevailing views on cognition and agency. On one side, we have what's called non-embodied cognitive agency, or NECA.
NECA.
This view conceptualizes the mind and cognition primarily as abstract symbol manipulation. Think information processing. Its core tenet is that cognitive processes, thinking, reasoning, problem solving, can be defined and understood without any essential reference to the agent's physical embodiment, to the body itself.
Mind is software, body as hardware, essentially.
Kind of. Think back to foundational ideas from pioneers like Alan Turing, who envisioned computation as something independent of any specific machine. Or David Marr's influential computational principle in vision science, which proposed that cognitive processing could be defined purely algorithmically, independently of the hardware or body that implements it. This abstract, disembodied view is, in fact, the deep conceptual basis for how many digital devices, computers, smartphones, most AI systems today are fundamentally built. They prioritize information processing and logic, largely separate from any physical, lived, feeling body.
Okay, so that's NECA. What's the alternative?
On the other side, there's embodied cognitive agency, or ECA. This perspective strongly argues the opposite, that cognition isn't just happening in the brain, detached from the body. It significantly draws upon and is actively shaped by our full bodily capacities and our dynamic interaction with the physical world, both in how we originally develop a skill, like learning to walk or talk, and how we use it in real time.
The body shapes the mind, and the mind shapes the body.
Exactly. Its philosophical roots are deep in phenomenology, with thinkers like Maurice Merleau-Ponty emphasizing the crucial role of the lived body. He saw it not just as a container for the mind, but as a constitutive or transcendental principle for our very experience of the world, our sense of self, and even our fundamental understanding of others through empathy and shared experience.
So how does this theoretical divide, NECA versus ECA, actually play out in our daily digital interactions? What are the real-world consequences?
Let's consider a really common yet profoundly insightful example. Using AI chatbots for medical advice. Imagine you're experiencing some kind of, say, dull, persistent pain, and maybe your doctor's office now uses an AI chatbot for initial symptom screening or basic advice before you see a human doctor.
Increasingly common scenario.
Very. Now, in a traditional face-to-face doctor visit, there's immense embodied engagement, isn't there? Your doctor picks up on your grimaces when they palpate an area, your subtle shifts in posture, maybe a slight wince you try to hide, or an involuntary sigh, all those rich nonverbal cues. Doctors are extensively trained to spot and interpret these signals, and you yourself have a deep intuitive bodily knowledge of interaction. You know how to show where it hurts, how to react. Your lived body is an absolutely integral part of communicating that deeply subjective personal experience of pain.
It's a whole body conversation in a way.
Totally. But when you interact with a medical chatbot, you typically communicate everything you feel via words, right? You're typing it out onto a screen or maybe speaking to an interface. There are no bodily expressions involved for the AI to perceive or for you to naturally express. In fact, you might even experience a subtle, almost imperceptible distancing from your body as you consciously try to objectify and articulate those subjective sensations into purely linguistic terms, translating feeling into data.
And the chatbot itself.
And the chatbot, from its purely computational perspective, has arguably never experienced pain itself. It profoundly lacks that embodied framework for understanding what pain feels like. It processes symptoms as data points, patterns to match. This stark contrast powerfully highlights how digital interaction can lead us to perform complex cognitive tasks, like explaining the nature and quality of our pain without drawing on those rich, immediate, and often automatic embodied skills and cues. And this, on the surface, seems to support the NECA view that cognition can indeed happen effectively in a disembodied way.
Yet, what's really intriguing here is that despite this dramatically reduced embodied engagement, we humans clearly do successfully interact with and sometimes even develop surprisingly strong attachments to overtly disembodied agents. Think about Siri on our phones or Amazon's Alexa in our living rooms.
People talk to them all the time.
All the time. We often seek interpersonal relationships and social connections with them, asking them deeply personal questions, telling them our problems, sometimes even looking for emotional support. Research shows we readily attribute robust agentive properties to them. We treat them as if they have intentions, understanding, maybe even feelings.
Even though we know they're just code.
Even though we know they're just code. And some scholars suggest these interactions can even deeply impact the affective lives of human partners, sometimes contributing to a phenomenon one researcher, Elisa Candiotto, calls extended loneliness, where the AI fills a social gap but perhaps doesn't truly satisfy deeper needs. All of this happens without these artificial agents having any significant physical embodiment, which on the surface directly challenges the ECA idea that truly robust and meaningful interaction must involve a lived body.
This complex interplay, this tension between our embodied nature and our disembodied tools, leads to two particularly intriguing hypotheses about our evolving interaction with the digital world. The first is called the hypothesis of cognitive expense, or HCE.
Cognitive expense, meaning it takes more mental effort.
Exactly. This theory posits that our normal embodied interaction, the way we naturally engage with other people face-to-face, is generally cognitively cheap. It's largely automatic, requiring minimal conscious effort. Think about how effortlessly you usually pick up on someone's mood. From their facial expression, their tone of voice, their body language, it just happens.
Intuitive.
Very intuitive. But without this immediate, rich, embodied context, as is often the case in digital interaction, like texting, email, even sometimes video calls with lag, successful engagement demands more conceptual and inferential ways of understanding others. You have to actively figure out what they mean, what they're feeling. This actively recruits high-level cognitive resources. In short, it is much more cognitively expensive for our brains. It takes more work.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine you're on a video call, having a really important, maybe sensitive or emotional discussion with someone, and suddenly the video freezes, but the audio continues. You instantly lose all those real-time facial cues, the micro-expressions, the subtle shifts in posture that convey so much meaning. You then have to rely far more heavily on just inferential mechanisms of mind reading, trying to piece together what the other person is truly feeling or intending solely from their words and the tone of their voice, which can be ambiguous. That's a considerably greater cognitive load, a lot more mental work.
And the implication of this cognitive expense.
A crucial implication of HCE is that because cognitively expensive resources are more easily suspended or abandoned if the task gets too challenging, our brains tend to follow a law of least mental effort. Digital interactions might be inherently more prone to breakdown or misunderstanding. If crucial embodied cues aren't available and the inference required becomes too difficult or taxing, we might simply disengage, misinterpret, or jump to conclusions. Communication becomes more fragile.
Okay, that's HCE. What's the second hypothesis?
The second related idea is the hypothesis of disembodied agency, or HDA. This suggests that when we interact digitally, especially with purely text-based or voice-based agents, we tend to ascribe personhood and agency to our interaction partners primarily as mental beings, but not necessarily as embodied beings.
We treat them like minds without bodies.
Kind of, yeah. And this attribution likely exists on a spectrum. You might still ascribe a rich psychophysical model to a loved one you're video chatting with, integrating their visible expressions with your mental model of them. But with a simple chatbot, like a customer service bot, you might only ascribe a very basic as-if mental agency, treating it as if it understands, but without any real expectation or sense of embodied agency behind it.
But HDA also suggests we can attribute rich agency even without embodiment?
Yes, and this is where it challenges ECA more directly. HDA posits that we can indeed ascribe rich mental agency, even to highly sophisticated non-embodied AI. Think about advanced programs capable of holding complex philosophical conversations, writing surprisingly creative poetry, or generating stunning artwork. If we genuinely start treating these systems as having rich minds, despite their lack of bodies, this, HDA proponents argue, refutes the strong ECA claim that embodied cognition is the sole or de facto way we engage with and understand other agents.
But this HDA has potential downsides too, right?
Definitely. Despite its intriguing nature, HDA faces its own set of drawbacks and potential pitfalls. First, it relies heavily on the HCE we just discussed. It's arguably very cognitively demanding to consistently ascribe rich mental agency to a truly non-embodied agent over long periods. It takes effort to maintain that as-if stance. Second, and perhaps more profoundly concerning in the long run, HGA suggests that extensive, pervasive digital interaction could potentially distort our own sense of the lived body by consistently and extensively suppressing our motoric engagement, by constantly interacting in ways that do not require or engage our full bodily presence, our posture, our gestures. If we spend too much time interacting as disembodied minds, could it have a counterproductive effect on our overall sense of integrated agency, our connection to the physical world, and even our own bodily awareness? That's a serious open question.
Okay, but this gets even more complex, doesn't it? Because what if the very tools we use to communicate digitally, like language itself, are actually deeply embodied to begin with?
Exactly. Here's where it gets really interesting, creating an even deeper layer of complexity. Many contemporary theories of cognition and linguistics, particularly those in the embodied cognition camp, argue precisely this point, that linguistic meaning itself is fundamentally embodied. Meaning isn't just abstract symbols. It relies heavily on our sensorimotor engagement with the world.
Meaning is grounded in bodily experience.
That's the core idea. There's a strong, arguably undeniable connection between our emotions, our bodily feelings, our sensory experiences, and how we construct and make sense of words and concepts. Thinkers like George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, with their work on conceptual metaphor, or Lawrence Barsalou, with his perceptual symbol systems theory, have extensively explored these deep connections. Meaning isn't abstract. It's rooted in how we physically interact with and perceive the world.
Can you give an example related to language, like reading?
Sure, take reading. It seems like a purely cognitive, maybe even disembodied act, just processing symbols on a page or screen. But many argue it's far from it. It's actually considered a deep sensorimotor engagement. Even way back in 1874, the neurologist Carl Wernicke noted that truly understanding the concept of the word bell involves activating associated visual memories, what a bell looks like, tactile memories, what it feels like to touch one, its weight, its texture, and auditory memories, what it sounds like. These sensorimotor associations are part of the word's meaning network in the brain.
And there's evidence from brain injury, too.
Absolutely. The brilliant Soviet neuropsychologist Alexander Luria provided compelling examples. He described neuropathological patients who struggle to recognize written words after a brain injury. They could sometimes learn to read again, not just by looking, but by reestablishing connections between motor movements and the visual form, for instance, by painstakingly tracing the shapes of letters with their fingers. The meaning only truly emerged or became stable for the patient when they could re-engage with the word via these bodily sensorimotor interactions.
Wow. So this highlights a really crucial asymmetry with AI, doesn't it?
A profound asymmetry. Human reading, even silent reading, inherently involves this rich, complex, real-time sensorimotor interaction and simulation, even if it's mostly unconscious. Meanwhile, disembodied interaction partners such as AI bots decode symbols with no real-time sensorimotor interaction with a context. They process text purely as statistical patterns and data without any grounding in lived bodily experience.
They don't feel the meaning.
Exactly. They don't have the bodily anchors for meaning that we do. This fundamental asymmetry, this lack of grounding, could be profoundly damaging, particularly in scenarios where disembodied AI is increasingly used to evaluate human educational outcomes, assess creative writing, or even make judgments in sensitive areas like healthcare or law. It raises very serious questions about whether AI can truly understand language nuances, context, subtext, or emotional depth in the same way humans do, because it lacks a body, lacks lived experience.
That's like they can talk the talk, but not walk the walk.
Precisely. In fact, renowned computational neuroscientist Terence Sajowski argues exactly that. He suggests that large language models, or LLMs, the powerful AI systems behind tools like ChatGPT, will need to be fundamentally incorporated into robotics, into sensorimotor systems, if they are ever to achieve what he calls artificial general autonomy. Essentially, he's saying for AI to achieve true, flexible, grounded intelligence, it needs to walk the walk, interact physically with the world, not just talk the talk by manipulating symbols. It needs a body, or at least a much richer sensorimotor interface with the world.
Okay, let's extend this thought about embodiment to something even more basic: handwriting versus digital typing. We can look at this through the philosophical lens of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who is deeply interested in the nature of language, meaning, and different forms of representation.
Handwriting.
Yeah.
It feels different, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. For humans, handwriting is often described as a fundamentally deeply embodied practice. It's not just putting abstract marks on a page. It's a unique form of self-expression. No two people have exactly the same handwriting, right? And the physical act itself engages our sensory-motor system, our attention, our fine motor control, and our cognition in a very integrated way. Some argue it plays a central constitutive meaning-making role.
Like how your handwriting can reflect your mood.
Exactly. Think of the subtle nuances of calligraphy, where the pressure, the force, the speed, and the flow of a stroke can physically embody and convey profound emotions or artistic intent in a way that uniform digital fonts rarely can.
So the big question arises then. Does transitioning almost entirely, as many of us have, from handwriting to digital writing, like typing on a keyboard or typing on glass keypads, does that mean we are losing this crucial form of embodied cognitive agency? Are we perhaps becoming incapable of certain meaning-making acts that were once deeply tied to the physical embodied act of writing? Are we sacrificing a deep, expressive, physically engaged practice for mere speed and efficiency?
It's a real concern. Historically, some philosophers like Martin Heidegger or Oswald Spengler argued precisely this point. They lamented that mechanical writing, like the typewriter, degrades the word, seeing it as part of what they considered civilization's broader deterioration from a richer, more authentic, embodied culture.
They saw technology as a loss.
They did. However, Wittgenstein, in his typically nuanced and practical fashion, offered a powerful counterargument. He himself transitioned from largely handwritten manuscripts to using a typewriter for later works. He closely examined this shift. He acknowledged that handwriting offered him full material flexibility for exploring thoughts, for revisions, for seeing the process unfold physically. His different handwriting modes, sometimes sketchy and rapid, sometimes nervous, sometimes neat and calligraphic, clearly revealed his thinking process and even his moods.
He saw the expressiveness.
He absolutely saw what was lost. He acknowledged that the typewriter's mechanical uniformity meant a clear loss of that kind of spontaneous expressivity found in his handwritten drafts. But, and this is crucial, he didn't see it as an ultimate decline or degradation of meaning itself. Instead, he simply adapted. He developed new, arguably simpler markup techniques and created a strikingly simple, yet equally, if not more, clear and surveyable representation of the graphic structure of his thoughts using the constraints of the typewriter.
So, a different skill, not necessarily a lesser one.
That was his conclusion. Transitioning to technology that reduces direct embodied engagement is not necessarily a deterioration in the meaning-making act. Rather, he saw it as a move from one skilled practice to another. Existing cognitive skills, like structuring arguments or clarifying thoughts, can often be carried over into new mediums. And crucially, new technology often opens up new ways of interaction and meaning-making that were previously unimaginable. Think about hyperlinks, easy editing, global collaboration, things impossible with handwriting. It's not just about loss. It's about adaptation, evolution, and the emergence of entirely new possibilities for expression, cognition, and communication.
This prompts a really fascinating question, though, one that takes us even further. If technology can fundamentally change the way we express meaning, the way we interact, the skills we develop, what does this ongoing, accelerating digital transformation ultimately do to our very bodies? And by extension, to our profound sense of self, our agency, our connection to the physical world. It forces us to continually reevaluate that fundamental dynamic connection between our physical being and our cognitive processes in a landscape that is constantly, rapidly evolving technologically.
And this leads us really to a fascinating final complication in this whole discussion. The deep integration of digital technology might be actively challenging and perhaps even radically expanding the very notion of what constitutes the body itself.
Expanding the body, how so?
Well, there's a compelling normative claim emerging from research in human-computer interaction and related fields. The idea is that truly successful, intuitive digital technology should, ideally, allow for the transfer and use of our deeply embodied skills. Why? Because these skills, honed over millennia of evolution, intuitively offer cognitively cheap means of communication. Think about how little mental effort it takes to interpret a smile or a pointed finger versus deciphering complex code or text.
Embodied interaction is efficient.
Exactly, and crucially, relying on these embodied skills helps preserve our sense of the lived body that fundamentally grounds our sense of agency in an experiential unity. It keeps us feeling whole and connected. The underlying idea is that for truly efficient, intuitive, and fundamentally human-like interaction, even in digital realms, some form of embodied engagement, even if it's artificial or virtual, remains key.
And this explains why we're seeing things like the metaverse, haptics.
Precisely. This helps explain why digital technology developers are now actively trying to reintroduce embodied engagement into digital spaces, even if it's through what we call virtual embodiments, avatars in platforms like the metaverse that mimic our movements, or haptic feedback suits that let us feel virtual objects.
There are also examples in medicine, right? Neuroprosthetics.
Absolutely. Consider the incredibly compelling example of advanced speech neuroprostheses being developed for individuals with severe paralysis, like locked-in syndrome. These sophisticated devices can decode neural signals related to intended speech and then restore full embodied communication, not just by producing text, but often through highly realistic facial avatar animation on a screen that mirrors the intended speech and expressions.
So the avatar becomes a new kind of body.
In very real sense, yes. Even if this new digital embodiment is very different from the original material body, it powerfully supports the intuition that efficient interaction demands embodied interaction, even if that body is not the usual material body, but rather a sophisticated digital representation, a virtual proxy.
Philosophers are thinking about this too.
Oh, yes. Philosophers like Thomas Metzinger have explored these ideas extensively, proposing concepts such as amnestic re-embodiment, the hypothetical possibility of experiencing a new, perhaps virtual body so fully that you might even forget the old one, and the emergence of a virtual Lebenswelt, a coherent virtual life world where we might live and act through avatars.
Superminds and superbodies.
He uses terms like that, yes. These concepts imagine future superminds, perhaps augmented by AI connected to superbodies, which are not necessarily material, but could be highly realistic virtual reenactments of our sensor-motor skills, often potentially with augmented capacities that far exceed what our biological bodies can achieve, like flying or having enhanced senses.
So just like the idea of extended minds, where our tools become part of our thinking.
Exactly. It leads directly to the idea of extended bodies. If virtual reality becomes a genuine, immersive, interactive reality, then in these new realities built primarily on mental skills and digital forms, the argument goes, we nonetheless continue to be in a body, albeit of a new kind, but with deep echoes of the original. The mind and body, even in these virtual realms, continue to function as a dynamic continuum, potentially revealing hitherto unexplored, perhaps even unimaginable, aspects of human agency, embodiment, and existence itself. The definition of body itself might be expanding. Hashtag outro.
Wow. We've really journeyed today, haven't we? Through the intricate, often dizzying dance between free will and determinism. We've gone from the lightning-fast firing of individual neurons in Libet's lab,
all the way to the majestic, millennia-long shaping of rivers like the Narmada.
and from the hallowed, often intimidating halls of justice grappling with blame and responsibility.
To the subtle, ever-evolving nuances of our interactions in the digital frontier, it's a truly vast and captivating intellectual landscape we've touched on.
It really is.
Indeed. We've explored how groundbreaking neuroscientific insights, like those from Libet's experiments, profoundly challenge our intuitive, everyday sense of conscious control over our actions, and how that leads to critical, potentially uncomfortable questions about individual responsibility and the very foundations of our legal systems.
We even ventured into some pretty radical alternatives, like the public health quarantine model or neuroabolitionism, which really push us to think differently, emphasizing compassion and rehabilitation over traditional retribution.
Right. And we also saw how embracing a more nuanced, perhaps even more deterministic view of human behavior doesn't have to be seen as a defeat or a loss of agency. It could potentially be a transformative path towards greater compassion, both for others and ourselves, leading to deeper self-forgiveness and maybe even a richer understanding of our place in the world.
That story of the farmer by the Narmada River really sticks with you, doesn't it? That sense of finding peace not by asserting control, but by understanding the flow.
It does. And then we looked at how our very sense of agency, our understanding of self, and our experience of embodiment is fluidly evolving in this rapidly advancing digital age, with new forms of interaction constantly emerging and even suggestions of entirely new kinds of bodies taking shape within virtual spaces.
It's just a powerful reminder, I think, that our fundamental understanding of ourselves, what we are, the nature of our choices, our intricate connection to reality, it isn't static. It's a story that is constantly evolving, constantly being rewritten.
Absolutely. It's a narrative profoundly influenced by the relentless currents of scientific discovery, the timeless ongoing debates of philosophy, and the ever-accelerating pace of technological innovation. It's a rich, complex, unfolding story of what it truly means to be human in the 21st century and beyond. There's certainly no easy answers here.
No easy answers at all. It's been an incredible deep dive, a real journey through some challenging but fascinating territory. We sincerely hope you found these insights as compelling, as thought-provoking, and perhaps even as potentially transformative as we have. Thanks for joining us.